A commanding baritone, an imposing presence. Paul Winfield was 1970s, Hollywood's ultimate symbol of black masculinity and moral authority, portraying everything from the stoic patriarch to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But his historic success demanded a brutal ransom. The man who broke racial barriers with his voice was forced into terrified, lifelong silence about his sexuality. For 30 years, the industry that profited from his dignity forced him to hide his partner behind fake PR romances and ruthless morality clauses. Hollywood profited from his talent, used his fear to control him, and erased his true identity the moment he died. It was only in death, buried next to the man he loved, that he could finally stop acting. Paul Edward Winfield was born on May 22, 1939. While some historical records and press materials occasionally cited Dallas, Texas as his birthplace, his formative reality was undeniably rooted in Los Angeles, California. Specifically, he grew up in Watts. In the 1940s and 1950s, long before the neighborhood became internationally synonymous with the civil unrest of 1965, Watts was a working-class enclave. It was a place defined by severe economic limitations, but also by a relentless drive for survival and community resilience. Winfield's early life was framed by the grueling realities of the American working class. He was raised initially by a single mother. She was a union organizer in the garment industry, a demanding and often unforgiving line of work that required long hours for meager pay. She later remarried, and Winfield's stepfather worked as a municipal trash collector. There was no inherited wealth, no industry connections, and no safety net. The lessons instilled in the young Winfield were pragmatic. Work hard, keep your head down, and understand that the world is not designed to give you second chances. In this environment, cinema was a temporary escape, but it rarely offered a reflection of his own humanity. The Hollywood of the 1940s relegated black actors almost exclusively to the margins. They were cast as maids, porters, chauffeurs, or comic relief. They were props in white narratives. This cultural messaging reinforced the societal boundaries drawn around a young black boy in Watts. That paradigm shattered for Winfield when he was 8 years old. In 1949, he sat in a local theater and watched a film called Home of the Brave. The movie centered on a black American soldier experiencing psychological trauma during the World War II, played by actor James Edwards. For the first time in his life, Winfield saw a black man on screen who was not subservient. He saw a complex, dignified human being carrying the weight of a narrative. This was a profound psychological catalyst. It was the exact moment Winfield realized that acting was not merely entertainment. He recognized it as a potent instrument for social change. If a film could make him feel seen, it could also force the broader society to see him. Driven by this revelation, Winfield proved to be exceptionally intelligent. He navigated the public school system with a sharp, analytical mind, eventually earning a highly coveted academic scholarship to Yale University. For a young man from Watts in the late 1950s, an Ivy League scholarship was the ultimate ticket out of poverty. It was the fulfillment of the American dream. Yet Winfield made a calculated and telling decision. He turned it down. His refusal of Yale was not an act of rebellion, but one of acute self-preservation. He looked at the reality of moving across the country to New Haven, Connecticut. He saw an overwhelmingly white elite institution steeped in centuries of privilege. He calculated the intense racial isolation he would face, the absolute lack of a support system, and the crushing pressure to assimilate into an environment fundamentally hostile to his existence. He chose not to subject himself to that specific brand of psychological warfare. Instead, Winfield chose to remain on the West Coast. He enrolled first at Stanford University and later transferred to the University of California, Los Angeles. But even in the relatively more diverse environment of the California public university system, the weight of his identity was omnipresent. In the mid-20th century, the prevailing survival strategy for upwardly mobile African Americans was to present a flawless, unassailable public image. The collective burden of racial uplift rested on the shoulders of the individual. Any personal failing, any deviation from strict societal norms would be weaponized by the white majority to justify continued discrimination against the entire community. Winfield internalized this pressure deeply. He understood that to succeed, he had to be perfect. He had to be articulate, impeccably dressed, and morally unblemished according to the conservative standards of the era. This included a strict adherence to traditional gender roles and heteronormativity. The Black community, fighting a relentless battle for basic civil rights, had no margin of error, and certainly no tolerance for the social liability of homosexuality. The closet was not just a personal choice, it was a communal mandate. As Winfield immersed himself in university life, his passion for the stage deepened. He studied theater, dissecting the craft, preparing himself to become the kind of actor he had seen in Home of the Brave. He was meticulous. Yet, just as he approached the finish line of his formal education, he made another radical choice. With only 6 credits remaining to complete his degree at UCLA, he dropped out. The decision marked his official entry into the professional world of acting. He traded the structured safety of academia for the precarious reality of the stage. But as he stepped into the professional spotlight, he was already wearing a heavy, invisible armor. The psychology of the young actor was set. He was driven by a genuine, burning desire to use his talent to dismantle racial prejudice. But simultaneously, he had locked away his fundamental identity. He was prepared to play any role the industry demanded of him, fully aware that his survival depended on ensuring the public never discovered his heavily guarded reality. The transition from the academic theater of UCLA to the professional sound stages of Los Angeles was brutal and swift. In the late 1960s, the American television and film industry was undergoing a seismic shift. The old studio system was collapsing, making way for the new Hollywood era, characterized by gritty realism and auteur directors. Yet for Black actors, the gates remained heavily guarded. Opportunities were largely confined to guest spots on television procedurals or secondary roles designed to provide background texture rather than narrative substance. Winfield navigated this landscape with a strategist's precision. He secured early television work on series like Julia in 1968, starring Diane Carroll. Julia was a landmark program, the first weekly series to star an African-American woman in a non-stereotypical role. Being adjacent to this production provided Winfield with an immediate education in the intense public scrutiny applied to Black artists who dared to portray middle-class respectability. He observed firsthand how the media, the network executives, and the viewing public dissected every aspect of the actors' lives to ensure they fit a comfortable, non-threatening narrative. He built a resume of solid, dependable television appearances, establishing himself as a reliable working actor. His physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep, resonant voice, made him a natural choice for authority figures. He played police officers, lawyers, and military men. Industry casting directors began to rely on him to deliver a specific brand of grounded, authoritative masculinity. He was being categorized, placed into a specific commercial box that he would soon find impossible to escape. The paradigm shifted entirely in 1972. Director Martin Ritt cast Winfield in the film adaptation of William H. Armstrong's novel Sounder. Set in the Deep South during the Great Depression, the film tells the story of a family of black sharecroppers struggling to survive. Winfield played Nathan Lee Morgan, the patriarch of the family, who is sentenced to hard labor for stealing food to feed his starving children. The year 1972 was the absolute peak of the blaxploitation era. Films like Superfly and Slaughter were dominating the box office. These movies offered black audiences anti-heroes, pimps, vigilantes, and hustlers operating outside the law. While commercially successful and culturally significant in their own right, these films presented a specific, often controversial version of black masculinity. Sounder functioned as the complete antithesis to the blaxploitation movement. Winfield's portrayal of Nathan Lee Morgan was an exercise in quiet dignity, immense emotional restraint, and unwavering familial devotion. The performance was devoid of the stylized swagger of his contemporaries. Instead, Winfield grounded the character in a deep, agonizing vulnerability that was historically unprecedented for a black male lead in a major Hollywood production. When Morgan reunites with his family after returning from the prison camp, running down a dirt road, his gait altered by physical trauma, yet overwhelmed by love, it became an indelible image in American cinema. The industry response was overwhelming. Critics praised the film for its humanity, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences recognized Winfield with a nomination for Best Actor. He was suddenly elevated from a working television actor to the absolute highest echelon of Hollywood prestige. However, this elevation came with an immediate, suffocating set of terms. By proving he could carry a major dramatic film, Winfield had proven his immense financial value to the studio system. He was no longer just an actor. He was a valuable commodity. And in the 1970s, the Hollywood machinery was ruthlessly efficient at protecting its commodities. Studio executives recognized that Winfield's appeal lay in his projection of unshakable patriarchal authority. He appealed to black audiences seeking dignified representation, and he appealed to white, liberal audiences who viewed him as a safe, noble figure. To monetize this image, the studios required absolute assurance that the man off-screen mirrored the man on screen. This compliance was enforced through the legal architecture of standard studio contracts. While the rigid, ironclad contracts of the Golden Age studio system had technically ended, modern iterations still retained powerful mechanisms of control. The most potent of these was the morality clause. Morality clauses gave employers the legal right to terminate a contract immediately, without severance or further obligation, if the artist engaged in conduct that brought them into public disrepute, scandal, or ridicule. While seemingly broad, in the context of the 1970s, the application of these clauses was highly specific. Homosexuality was not merely considered a scandal, it was a career-ending offense. The American Psychiatric Association still classified homosexuality as a mental disorder until 1973. In many states, private, consensual same-sex acts remained criminal offenses. For a black actor, the margin of error was non-existent. A white actor involved in a scandal might be quietly sidelined, sent to rehabilitation, or allowed to reinvent themselves after a designated period of public penance. A black actor facing a scandal involving homosexuality would be instantly and permanently exiled. The industry executives understood this leverage perfectly. The unwritten rule was clear. The studio would provide the platform, the prestige, and the paycheck, but in return, they owned the actor's public identity. Winfield, facing the apex of his career, accepted these terms. To actively protect this investment and maintain the illusion, Winfield required a credible defense strategy against the aggressive entertainment press of the era. Publications like Jet, Ebony, and mainstream tabloids thrived on celebrity gossip. A single man in his 30s with Winfield's profile was an obvious target for speculation. He needed a shield. The execution of this strategy occurred alongside his co-star from Sounder, Cicely Tyson. Tyson, who had also received an Oscar nomination for her role as his wife in the film, was facing her own immense industry pressures. Both were pioneers navigating an environment that scrutinized their every move. Following the production, Winfield made the decision to privately disclose his sexuality to Tyson. What followed is widely considered by industry historians as one of the most effective public relations maneuvers of the decade. Winfield and Tyson moved into the same house, living together for 18 months. They did not issue press releases announcing a romance, nor did they overtly parade for the cameras. They simply cohabitated, allowing the media machinery to draw its own inevitable conclusions. The strategy was brilliant in its passivity. The press, eager to capitalize on the on-screen chemistry of the Sounder co-stars, instantly framed the living arrangement as an intense real-life love affair. Articles were published detailing their off-screen bond, cementing their status as a prominent Hollywood power couple. The narrative was perfect. The dignified, historic black actors in love off-screen just as they were on screen. Neither Winfield nor Tyson ever explicitly confirmed an intimate relationship, but crucially, neither ever issued a denial. They allowed the public imagination to build the walls of their defense. This straight passing shield served both parties immensely. Tyson, known for her fierce commitment to portraying strong, positive black women, solidified her image as a leading lady. Winfield, meanwhile, acquired an impenetrable alibi. Any rumors whispering through the underground networks of Los Angeles were immediately neutralized by the public fact of his relationship with one of the most respected actresses in the business. The arrangement laid bare the fundamental cruelty of the Hollywood ecosystem. To survive as an artist, Winfield was forced to draft a peer into a complex domestic charade. His home, typically a sanctuary from the demands of public life, was transformed into a forward operating base for his public relations defense. The 18 months spent living with Tyson were not a reprieve from acting. They were an extension of his performance, requiring constant vigilance and absolute discipline. The necessity of this shield was proven a few years later when Winfield accepted the role that would apply the ultimate pressure test to his constructed persona. In 1978, NBC broadcast the ambitious, multi-part miniseries King, a sweeping dramatization of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Winfield was chosen to play the civil rights leader. The cultural weight of this casting decision cannot be overstated. Dr. King had been assassinated only a decade prior. He was not merely a historical figure, he was a contemporary martyr. His image was sacred, protected fiercely by his family, his organization, and the millions of people he had led. The actor chosen to portray him had to embody an impossible standard of moral fortitude, religious conviction, and patriarchal leadership. For Winfield, accepting the role of Dr. King was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. He was a closeted gay man stepping into the shoes of the ultimate symbol of traditional black masculinity and Christian leadership. He knew that the conservative factions of both the black church and the broader white American public would never accept a gay man as the face of the civil rights movement. If his secret were discovered while portraying Dr. King, it would not just destroy his career. It would be framed as a desecration of a national hero. The production of King was heavily monitored. Coretta Scott King and other key figures from the movement were involved in the development and approval of the project. Winfield had to navigate these interactions perfectly. He had to convince those closest to Dr. King that he was a suitable vessel for the man's legacy. He immersed himself in the role, studying King's cadence, his physical mannerisms, and his theological writings. He delivered a towering performance capturing the exhaustion, the political genius, and the profound burden of leadership that defined King's final years. He received an Emmy nomination for the performance, cementing his status as one of the preeminent actors of his generation. Yet the success of King locked the vault door permanently on his personal truth. By becoming the definitive on-screen representation of Martin Luther King Jr., Winfield became the ultimate property of the public trust. The industry had built him into a monument, and monuments are not permitted the messy, complicated realities of human existence. The straight illusion was no longer just a career strategy. It was an obligation to history. He had reached the summit of his profession, but in doing so, he had ensured that he could never, under any circumstances, come down from the pedestal and live as a free man. While the public consumed the pristine image of Paul Winfield, the Oscar nominee, the dignified patriarch, the embodiment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a radically different reality existed in the shadows of Los Angeles. The geography of his life was strictly compartmentalized. The Hollywood studios in Burbank and Culver City demanded the performance of heteronormativity. To find any semblance of authenticity, Winfield had to navigate the city's underground ecosystem. In the 1970s and 1980s, the LGBTQ plus community in Los Angeles operated entirely off the grid. This was an era defined by aggressive police raids, vice squad entrapment, and the constant threat of public exposure. For a black gay man, the terrain was even more perilous. The mainstream gay liberation movement of the time was overwhelmingly white, often replicating the same racial exclusion found in broader society. Simultaneously, the conservative factions of the black community viewed homosexuality as a fundamental betrayal of racial solidarity. Winfield was trapped in a demographic no man's land. He had everything to lose and nowhere safe to stand. Sanctuary, when it could be found, existed behind unmarked doors. Establishments like Jewel's Catch One, which opened in Los Angeles in 1973, became vital clandestine hubs for Black LGBTQ plus individuals. These venues were not merely nightclubs, they were fortresses against a hostile world. Yet, for a man with Winfield's immense level of fame, even these sanctuaries carried terrifying risks. He possessed one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. Anonymity was impossible. Many close to him noted that his rare ventures into the underground scene were heavily guarded exercises in logistics, fraught with the constant paranoia of being recognized, photographed, or blackmailed by an opportunist. The fear of exposure was not a hypothetical anxiety. It was a highly rational response to the mechanics of the entertainment industry. Tabloid journalism in the 1970s was entering a ruthless, highly lucrative era. Publications possessed massive budgets dedicated to dismantling the pristine images built by studio publicists. The paparazzi operated with near impunity. To survive, Winfield had to operate his personal life with the precision of a counterintelligence agent. It was within this suffocating atmosphere of surveillance and secrecy that Winfield forged the most significant relationship of his life. Away from the industry's flashing cameras, he met Charles Gillan Jr. Gillan was not an actor, a producer, or a studio executive. He was a successful architect. This distinction was critical. In Gillan, Winfield found a partner utterly disconnected from the toxic, transactional machinery of Hollywood. Gillan provided a tether to reality, a grounding force that stood in stark contrast to the performative demands of Winfield's career. Their relationship, which would endure for 30 years, became the hidden core of Winfield's existence. However, building a life together required constructing a sophisticated permanent alibi. Two adult men living together in a wealthy Los Angeles enclave inevitably drew suspicion. They needed a cover story that the conservative public and the invasive press would accept without further scrutiny. They found their solution in a shared passion, the breeding and showing of champion pug dogs. This was not merely a casual hobby. It functioned as a strategic, highly effective domestic shield. The dogs provided a legitimate, eccentric, and entirely desexualized reason for the two men to cohabitate, travel together, and share a financial footprint. When journalists or colleagues inquired about his living situation, Winfield could effortlessly pivot the conversation to canine pedigrees and dog show logistics. It was a brilliant, tragic maneuver. They hid their 30-year romance in plain sight, disguising a profound domestic partnership as a quirky bachelor enterprise. The psychological toll of this constant masquerade was severe. Inside the walls of their home, they were life partners. The moment they stepped past their front gate, the power dynamic shifted violently. Gillan was stripped of his identity. At industry events, premieres, and public dinners, Gillan was introduced through a rotating menu of sterilized titles. He was the housemate. He was the business associate. He was the assistant. Industry insiders suggest that the humiliation of these public demotions weighed heavily on both men, a constant reminder that their love was viewed by the surrounding world as a liability to be managed. The stress of maintaining this fortress was immense, and the facade nearly collapsed in the spring of 1975. Fresh off the momentum of his Academy Award nomination for Sounder, Winfield was arrested by the Los Angeles Police Department for possession of marijuana. He ultimately pleaded guilty and was hit with an $11,000 fine, an astronomical sum for the era, and a stark legal reprimand. The mainstream press reported the incident as a standard celebrity misjudgment. The underlying reality was far more complex. It was widely understood in their inner circle that Winfield's substance use was not recreational indulgence. It was anesthesia. The marijuana functioned as a vital coping mechanism to blunt the crushing anxiety of his dual existence. He was a man holding up the structural integrity of a massive public lie, terrified that a single misstep would obliterate his historic achievements and destroy his family's financial security. Rather than destroying his career, the 1973 arrest provided the Hollywood power structure with the ultimate leverage. The studios and networks did not abandon him. Instead, they managed the fallout. In doing so, they tightened their grip. Studio fixers and high-powered publicists stepped in to ensure the story was contained and the probation terms were met quietly. But this protection came at a steep price. Winfield was now indebted to the system that policed his identity. He had proven himself to be a risk, which meant his public image required even stricter management. The arrest functioned as a ruthless demonstration of ownership. The studios did not merely salvage his career, they purchased his absolute compliance. By silencing the scandal, the executives forged a permanent debt, ensuring that the artist's public image remained entirely chained to their corporate interests. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Winfield's career trajectory shifted. The era of the dignified, socially conscious dramas that defined his early success began to wane, replaced by high-concept blockbusters. The industry, having extracted the maximum commercial value from his image as a leading man, relegated him to supporting roles. Yet, he adapted with remarkable resilience. His commanding voice and imposing physical presence made him a highly sought-after character actor in the burgeoning science fiction genre. He brought immediate gravitas to projects that might otherwise have lacked weight. He secured pivotal roles in massive cultural properties. He played Captain Clark Terrell in the 1982 landmark film Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, executing a memorable, tragic performance. 2 years later, he anchored the police procedural elements of James Cameron's revolutionary 1984 sci-fi thriller, The Terminator, playing Lieutenant Ed Traxler. These roles ensured his continued financial security and kept him firmly in the public consciousness. He was working constantly, navigating film sets and television stages with the consummate professionalism of a veteran actor. Yet, as he built an undeniable legacy in genre cinema, a new, unprecedented terror was quietly decimating the underground ecosystem he had navigated for decades. The pressure of the closet was about to be eclipsed by a profound medical catastrophe. The landscape of secrecy that Winfield and Gillan had so carefully constructed was about to become a matter of literal life and death. The arrival of the 1980s brought a terrifying new variable into the carefully managed equation of Paul Winfield's life. The emergence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic fundamentally altered the landscape for gay men across the globe. But in Los Angeles, and specifically within the ruthless corridors of the entertainment industry, the virus was not just a public health crisis. It was a weaponized social purge. In 1985, the world learned that Rock Hudson, the ultimate mid-century symbol of rugged, heterosexual American masculinity, was dying of AIDS. The revelation sent shock waves through studio boardrooms. The Hollywood power structure did not respond with empathy. It responded with clinical, panicked self-preservation. Executives were terrified that their expensive stars might be harboring a secret that could instantly render them uninsurable and unmarketable. Morality clauses were unofficially expanded. Whispers about an actor's private life, which previously might have just cost them a specific role, now threatened to have them blacklisted entirely as a health and financial liability. For Winfield, the margin for error went from razor thin to non-existent. He was a black man in his 40s, operating in an industry that was already looking to replace him with a younger generation of talent. The underground networks and private clubs that had once offered a sliver of sanctuary were now ground zero for a devastating plague. Friends and colleagues began to disappear. Obituaries cited pneumonia or rare cancers, the coded language of a frightened society. Winfield and Charles Gillan Jr. retreated further behind the walls of their Los Angeles home. Their shared interest in breeding champion pugs, initially conceived as a PR shield, now functioned as an absolute quarantine. They aged together in a state of hypervigilance, watching an entire generation of their peers get wiped out while remaining entirely silent to protect Winfield's livelihood. He survived the AIDS epidemic, but the closet still demanded a physical toll. The human body is a ledger. It keeps a meticulous accounting of every suppressed truth and every performance executed under duress. While Winfield avoided the virus, he was slowly being destroyed by the psychological collateral damage of his dual existence. As the 1980s transitioned into the 1990s, the physical manifestation of his chronic stress became impossible to ignore. Winfield developed severe life-altering obesity. In the medical community, the link between profound psychological trauma, identity suppression, and severe eating disorders is well documented. For decades, Winfield had lived in a state of constant low-grade terror. He had utilized marijuana in the 1970s as a coping mechanism, but as industry drug testing and public scrutiny intensified, that avenue became too risky. Food, however, was legal, accessible, and socially acceptable. It became his anesthesia. Binge eating provided a temporary, numbing relief from the crushing anxiety of the Hollywood machinery and the suffocating grief of watching his community decimated by a plague he was forbidden to mourn publicly. This drastic physical transformation fundamentally altered the trajectory of his career. Hollywood is an industry that deals in aesthetics. The leading man roles evaporated entirely. The muscular, imposing physicality that had defined his early career, the strength that made him a convincing action star in The Terminator, was gone. He was categorized into a new demographic, the heavy, older authority figure. Yet Winfield's immense talent refused to be sidelined. If his physical form was being scrutinized, he would rely on the one instrument the industry could not diminish: his voice. Winfield's deep, resonant baritone became one of the most recognizable sounds in American media. He pivoted heavily into voiceover work. He provided voices for animated series like Spider-Man, Gargoyles, and notably, a recurring role on The Simpsons as the authoritative Lucius Sweet. Voiceover acting offered a profound psychological reprieve. In a recording booth, Winfield was disembodied. He did not have to worry about lighting, camera angles, or the physical containment of his weight. He was judged solely on his raw talent and his ability to convey emotion through a microphone. He was temporarily freed from the physical prison the industry and his own coping mechanisms had built around him. His on-screen appearances during this era were strategic and impactful. In 1995, he secured the role of Judge Harold Nance on the critically acclaimed television drama Picket Fences. The character was a formidable, uncompromising legal mind. Winfield delivered a masterclass in grounded, authoritative acting, earning him the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Drama Series. There is a striking tragic irony to this specific victory. On television, Winfield was playing a federal judge, the ultimate arbiter of truth, justice, and societal rules. He sat behind a massive wooden bench passing judgment on the moral failings of others. In reality, he was a man who lived his entire life in fear of being judged, forced to hide his authentic self from the very society that was applauding his performance. Behind the Emmy victory, the medical reality was becoming dire. The severe obesity triggered chronic, unmanageable diabetes. His cardiovascular system was failing. The coping mechanisms that had allowed him to mentally survive the 1970s and 1980s were now systematically shutting down his organs in the 1990s. Late in the decade, the medical crisis reached a critical breaking point. Winfield's diabetes escalated to the point where he slipped into a severe diabetic coma. He was hospitalized, disappearing from the public eye as doctors fought to stabilize his plunging health metrics. The tabloids reported on his health struggles, framing it purely as a battle with weight and blood sugar. The clinical terminology masked the psychological root of the collapse. The press noted the symptom but entirely ignored the disease, a lifetime of weaponized silence. He emerged from the coma, but he was permanently diminished. He relied heavily on mobility aids, often using a wheelchair. The imposing patriarch of Sounder was now a fragile, ailing man in his early 60s. Throughout this harrowing physical decline, his primary caregiver, his absolute anchor to the world, was Charles Gillan Jr. For 3 decades, Gillan had accepted his role as the assistant in the eyes of the public. Now, behind closed doors, he was managing Winfield's complex medical regimens, coordinating his doctors, and providing the immense emotional support required for a man watching his own body fail. Their home, once a fortress against the paparazzi, transformed into a private hospice. They had successfully navigated the racist studio system of the 1970s, the terrifying AIDS paranoia of the 1980s, and the unforgiving career shifts of the 1990s. They had survived it all together. But the final devastating blow was not dealt by Hollywood executives or tabloid journalists. It was dealt by biology. In a brutal twist of fate, it was not the chronically ill Paul Winfield who would succumb first. In 2002, Charles Gillan Jr. was diagnosed with an aggressive form of bone cancer. The diagnosis of bone cancer is a devastating medical event under any circumstances. It is characterized by severe localized skeletal pain, structural weakening of the bones, and a grueling regimen of radiation and chemotherapy. For Charles Gillan Jr., the disease progressed with ruthless efficiency. For Paul Winfield, the diagnosis triggered a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate medical terror. It initiated a grueling navigation of the American healthcare system as a closeted same-sex couple in the early 2000s. To fully grasp the nightmare of this period, one must understand the socio-legal reality of the year 2002. The Defense of Marriage Act was in full federal effect. Same-sex marriage was not recognized in California or anywhere else in the United States. Civil unions and domestic partnerships offered only fractured state-by-state legal protections. Within the rigid architecture of hospital administration, a 30-year relationship meant absolutely nothing if it was not codified by a state-sanctioned marriage license. When Gillan required hospitalization, specialized oncology treatments, and critical care, Winfield could not rely on the standard protocols afforded to a spouse. To the attending physicians, nurses, and hospital administrators, Winfield was, legally speaking, a stranger. To secure the right to be in the hospital room, to consult with oncologists, and to make emergency medical decisions, same-sex couples of this era had to execute complex, ironclad legal documents. They required durable powers of attorney for health care, advance directives, and explicit HIPAA waivers. This bureaucratic burden was a secondary trauma. Every time Winfield entered the oncology ward, he had to be prepared to legally prove his right to stand next to the man he had lived with for 3 decades. He possessed one of the most recognizable faces and voices in American media, yet in the corridors of the medical system, he was stripped of his authority. The imposing actor who had commanded the screen in Sounder and King was reduced to carrying a briefcase full of notarized proxies just to ensure his partner was not left to die alone. The caregiving dynamic within their Los Angeles home violently inverted. For years, Gillan had been the physical anchor, managing the household, coordinating the breeding of their champion pugs, and navigating Winfield through the severe complications of his obesity and diabetes. Winfield had only recently survived a diabetic coma, leaving his cardiovascular system permanently compromised and his mobility heavily restricted. Now the ailing actor was forced to watch his healthy, robust partner be consumed by cancer. The fortress they had built against the invasive Hollywood press became a closed-off hospice. On March 5, 2002, Charles Gillan Jr. died. The immediate aftermath of Gillan's death plunged Winfield into a psychological state known in clinical psychology as disenfranchised grief. This term describes a profound loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. When a recognized spouse dies, society provides a framework for the survivor. Obituaries are published, funeral leaves are granted, and communities rally to offer condolences. Winfield was denied all of this. Because the relationship had been systematically hidden to protect his career, Winfield could not issue a public statement. He could not rely on his Hollywood peers or the studios for support because officially the industry did not know Charles Gillan Jr. existed. When industry colleagues did reach out, they offered condolences for the loss of his assistant or roommate. Winfield was forced to accept these sanitized sympathies, nodding along to the very lie that had constrained his entire adult life. He had to bury the love of his life while maintaining the precise heteronormative posture that the studios had demanded of him since 1972. The psychological devastation of this forced silence cannot be overstated. He was required to compartmentalize his profound trauma, swallowing the grief to maintain the professional stoicism expected of him. He was a widower in a society that refused to recognize his marriage. The isolation that followed Gillan's death was absolute. The large Los Angeles home, once defined by the shared routines of a 30-year partnership and the energetic presence of their dogs, went completely silent. Winfield was entirely alone. This psychological collapse had an immediate, catastrophic impact on his physical health. The human endocrine system cannot separate emotional trauma from physical stress. Severe grief triggers a massive, sustained release of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. In a healthy body, this is dangerous. In a body already severely compromised by decades of unmanageable diabetes, it is fatal. Cortisol inherently spikes blood sugar levels. For Winfield, the profound, unexpressed grief of losing Gillan rendered his diabetes completely uncontrollable. Medical adherence often plummets following the death of a primary caregiver. And without Gillan to manage his complex dietary and pharmaceutical regimens, Winfield's condition rapidly deteriorated. The physical weight he carried, the anesthesia he had used for decades to numb the pain of the closet, now became the mechanism of his final decline. Throughout 2002 and 2003, his mobility decreased drastically. His appearances in the public eye became exceedingly rare. He was largely confined to a wheelchair, his massive frame giving way to the internal ravages of cardiovascular disease and renal strain. He continued to accept sparse voiceover work when his health permitted, his resonant baritone remaining untouched even as his body failed. But the underlying reality was undeniable. He was a man dying of a broken heart, trapped inside a failing body, waiting out his final days in a house filled with the ghosts of a life he was never allowed to claim. The Hollywood machinery, which had meticulously tracked his box office returns, scrutinized his morality clauses, and managed the PR fallout of his 1970s arrest, now looked away. The industry has a notorious inability to process the slow, unglamorous decline of its aging stars. Winfield was no longer a bankable leading man, nor was he generating profitable scandals. He was simply an old, sick man mourning in secret. The surveillance that had terrified him for 30 years finally ceased, replaced by a profound, agonizing indifference. The final 2 years of Paul Winfield's life were a slow, agonizing surrender to the physical toll of his grief and the cumulative damage of his chronic illnesses. Without Charles Gillan Jr., the intricate support system that had kept Winfield alive through diabetic comas and severe cardiovascular distress completely disintegrated. The Los Angeles home became a monument to a vanished 30-year partnership. Winfield's public appearances dwindled to almost nothing. The industry that had once relied on his authoritative presence moved on, leaving him isolated in his decline. On March 7, 2004, the physical breaking point arrived. Paul Winfield suffered a massive heart attack and passed away at Queen of Angels, Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 64 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, heavily complicated by his long-standing battle with severe diabetes and obesity. However, a psychological autopsy of Winfield's life suggests a different primary catalyst. The heart attack was merely the final physiological failure of an organ that had been subjected to decades of relentless, unmanageable stress. The necessity of maintaining a dual existence, the constant paranoia of being outed by a ruthless tabloid press, the burden of racial representation, and finally, the disenfranchised grief of losing his partner in a society that refused to recognize their bond. All of these factors exacted a lethal biological tax. He did not simply die of heart disease. He died from the exhaustion of a lifelong mandated performance. The moment Winfield's death was confirmed, the Hollywood public relations machinery activated its standard protocols for a deceased icon. When a star of Winfield's historical magnitude passes away, the major media syndicates, the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, deploy pre-written obituaries. These documents are carefully curated to highlight the subject's cultural contributions, while aggressively sanitizing any elements that conflict with the established public narrative. The obituaries published in the second week of March 2004 were masterclasses in systemic erasure. The press meticulously chronicled his groundbreaking achievements. They highlighted his historic Academy Award nomination for Sounder. They lauded his primetime Emmy victory for Picket Fences. They respectfully recalled his defining portrayal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They noted his iconic voiceover work and his steady presence in major science fiction franchises. Yet, regarding his personal life, the media engaged in a coordinated clinical omission. The obituaries listed his surviving family members, often citing his sister or extended relatives, but completely excised the existence of Charles Gillan Jr. This omission was not an editorial oversight. It was a deliberate execution of the industry's unwritten rules. Even in 2004, the Hollywood establishment remained deeply invested in protecting the syndication value of its properties. Winfield's image was forever tied to the concept of strong, traditional, heterosexual black fatherhood. To acknowledge his 30-year same-sex partnership in his final historical record would have fundamentally altered the public's perception of his legacy. The industry, having profited immensely from his talent, performed a final act of violence against his identity. They erased the love of his life to preserve the marketability of his myth. He was remembered exactly as the studios had demanded he live, as a solitary, respectable, fiercely masculine monument, devoid of any controversial human truth. However, Winfield had anticipated this erasure. He knew the mechanics of the industry better than anyone, and he understood that the press would sanitize his life the moment he could no longer speak for himself. In response, he orchestrated a final permanent act of defiance. It was a silent protest executed not through a press release or a posthumous memoir, but through the undeniable reality of legal real estate. The act took place at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills. Forest Lawn is the ultimate necropolis of the American entertainment industry, the final resting place for studio moguls, legendary directors, and silver screen icons. It is a place obsessed with legacy and image. When Paul Winfield was laid to rest, he was not buried in a solitary plot befitting a lifelong bachelor, nor was he placed alongside his industry peers in a grand, isolated mausoleum. He was buried in the exact same grave as Charles Gillan Jr. The logistics of this shared burial were undeniably planned well in advance, legally solidified by Winfield before his own health failed, and executed despite the silence of the media. The dual headstone serves as a stark, unalterable historical document. It is a physical refutation of every sanitized obituary and every studio morality clause that governed his career In a city built entirely on illusions, the shared plot at Forest Lawn is an anchor of absolute truth. The legacy of Paul Winfield is one of profound contradiction. As an artist, he was a trailblazer who utilized his immense, undeniable talent to dismantle the racist caricatures of mid-century cinema. He forced a prejudiced society to look at a black man on screen and see dignity, complexity, and profound humanity. He achieved the highest accolades his profession had to offer, securing his place in the historical canon of American film. But the psychological reality of his existence reveals the devastating intersection of racism, homophobia, and capitalist exploitation. To achieve that monumental success, he was forced into a Faustian bargain. The Hollywood machinery demanded that he sacrifice his authentic identity to serve as a palatable symbol for the masses. He spent his entire adult life terrified of the very public that adored him, hiding his 30-year partnership behind coded language, fake PR relationships, and an impenetrable wall of silence. The ultimate tragedy of Paul Winfield is not that his talent went unrecognized. It is that his true self was never permitted to stand in the light. He defeated the racial barriers of his era, only to be imprisoned by the rigid gender and sexual expectations of the very industry that celebrated him. He was a master of his craft, but his most demanding, exhausting, and consequential role was the one he played off camera, the role of a straight man, performed flawlessly until his body could no longer sustain the lie. Only in death, lowered into the earth beside the man the world refused to acknowledge, was the great actor finally allowed to stop performing.